Welcome back. My name is Matt Reiners, and I'm the co-founder of EverSound, a company dedicated to improving quality of life for older adults by giving them the gift of hearing. Today, I'm joined by my friend, George Netscher, CEO of SafelyYou. I've gotten to know George over the years. Gosh, I was trying to think the other day, George, probably like 4 or 5 years. But it's just been awesome getting to know you. You're one of the good ones. And it's just been awesome to see, not only your success, but what SafelyYou has been doing in this industry and, other startups outside of EverSound that I'm most excited about. It's you guys. So kudos to all of that awesome work that you have done and will continue to do. And thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Matt. I think when you were talking about that, I think the first time we met with that, I want to say a Senior Living 100 event, shout out to the Lincoln team. But I remember seeing you they had like a competition where you were like supposed to dress like you were in the 50s and you went all out with a wig and short shorts. And
Danny Zuko, man.
Hey. Yeah, this guy, this is an impressive human that I just want to be friends with.
A $30 costume got me a $500 gift card. I thought it was like the best investment I've ever made.
It's a huge win. Yeah.
Yeah.
I also feel like I hear your name just come up all the time, like in conversations. It feels like you are in the senior living industry. You are like either maybe the most popular or just like everybody's best friend. Like people just bring up like, oh yeah, I met Matt. It's like, oh, I love Matt. Like everybody is just, on a first name basis with Matt Reiners.
I'm very grateful to hear that. I pay all of them to just say really nice things about me. So, I mean, it's good to see that that's working, but no, I mean, I've just fallen in love with the people in this space and there's so many just awesome, good people that it's just, it feels good to give back and help others and just continue to push the industry forward.
Here, it's fun to be in a space where, for the most part, like everybody really cares and like wants to make life better for people and have a very, shared set of values that makes it fun to connect with folks.
I agree. And so as we talk about some of these value stuff and, some of these starting stories, I'm curious, George, like what inspired you to start SafelyYou?
Yeah. I think like many folks in this space, a personal connection. Family with Alzheimer's, basically, where mom's mom had it, then mom and big sister had it. And it felt like mom was next one in line. And she has now moved into a community herself. She hasn't been diagnosed or anything. So it seems like we've still got some time. But it was very much with the like, okay, if the same thing happens like what happened to, the other folks in the family from the time I started the company, I've got like 10 years. And I see all the struggles that we're going through as a family. And I really want something better for my mom to be there by the time she gets there. And then, I was working in grad school on various projects trying to basically combine, so as a computer science PhD student trying to figure out like, is there some way to combine AI and Alzheimer's? Like, is there some overlap for these this new exciting set of technologies could be helpful for the people I care about. And that when I started kind of applying for grants from the NIH and stuff like that, that was really when I realized like, oh shit, like it is not just my family, like, holy crap, the impact of this disease that it's having on this country and the world and how little we know about the brain and how much trouble they're having in drug development. There's really a need for kind of more people to be doing more to help. Some of the statistics there that you might already know is like, it's 1 in 9 people over 65 and 1 in 3 people over 85 have Alzheimer's or another form of dementia. So it's like, that's so many people.
Yeah.
Like 65 is not old. And to think that like 1 in 9 have, some form, and that's only one form of cognitive impairment. Like obviously people can have strokes and traumatic brain injury. And like, we just don't have good tools to support folks with cognitive impairment. So that was really where I wanted to go. How can we kind of build a better world for folks who can't necessarily tell us what they need?
Yeah. And so I know one of those, especially with SafelyYou, is helping with falls, right? And then helping to document that and just give a sneak of what's actually happening. And you can kind of go into how that actually works. But, I'm curious when we think about falls, how are those impacting senior housing operators?
Yeah, here. So high level, the way the program works is we put a camera in the private room for folks that choose to have it. And we get about 90% opt-in. We're typically in the memory care or in supporting folks that have cognitive impairment in assisted living or skilled nursing. put a camera in the room, detect when somebody's on the ground with like truly world-leading accuracy. So we're generating on the order of one false alert every 2 years today, which we take a ton of pride in. And then only keep that video. So the goal is really to give a voice to folks who can't, tell us what they need or lose that ability over time. And so there's no other video kept. It's only that time they're on the ground, along with a little bit before and after, so we can see how they went to the ground, because that's basically the time when they would want to be able to tell us, like they would want to tell us if they hit their head or not, versus, a lot of communities today have a policy of when in doubt, send them out. So we have to make sure they're safe. If there's a potential head injury, we need to send them to the emergency room and make sure that there's not, a brain bleed we're not aware of. But that sending folks to the emergency room is really hard for a lot of reasons. They might come back with medications they didn't need, like antipsychotics and things like that. They may, just not have a great experience in the hospital. My mom was actually sent like last month, and she was admitted to the hospital, but they didn't have a bed for her. So she spent the night in the hallway, and like with, the staffing shortages happening right now, that is just happening.
Yeah.
And then obviously with COVID, like kind of the worst thing you can do is send them to the ER, where they're most likely to get exposed, bring them back, really hard to quarantine, really hard to like keep up mask adherence, whatever. And so then it gets spread and blah, blah, blah. So a lot of reasons, and just like, a lot of reasons it costs the family money, blah, 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 that you don't want to be sending folks to the ER. So what we do, detect the fall, make only that video available. You can see right away if they actually hit their head or not. Turns out that about 40% of the time, folks are actually self-lowering. So they're getting on the ground to pray and they can't get back up on their own, for instance. And then we provide a clinical team that can kind of figure out what happened, do the root cause analysis, ton of expertise, and say, oh, like we've seen this pattern before. This person is falling because they are, sitting on the recliner, part of their, like the footstool part of their recliner, and it's dropping out from under them. And like, okay, this chair, they might have left it at home, no longer appropriate for them. And we can kind of like think through. Or we had a very touching one where, a lady was caring for these two dolls, like they were her babies. I think if you've been in memory care, you've seen those. And like, this lady genuinely thinks these are her babies, right? I know you have a young child, and she is in a twin size bed, and she's falling out of bed because she's making space for the three of them in bed together. And when you see that, you're like, oh my God, it's not about medication review or whatever. The intervention was to get her a bassinet, and so she can see her babies are safe next to her, and then she has the bed to herself, and she's no longer kind of falling out of bed and being found on the floor and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
So basically detect when there's a fall, see how it happens, and then be able to provide guidance about what happens there. We're today supporting with about 5,000 falls a month, and have just like insight into how falls are happening that no one's ever had before, where we've seen now 50,000 falls, which is more than anybody in the world. So like our clinical team has just seen more falls happen, and we really feel an obligation to share a lot of what we're learning.
Yeah. And,
you asked a question about like, what's the impact, or what was your question?
Yeah. How are the falls? Because we talk about the individual, right? And like having to go to the ER and some of these things, you kind of started touching on how that's impacting the senior housing operators. But do you have any other thoughts of how those falls are impacting them?
Yeah. So great question. And we just released a big kind of our inaugural State of Falls report that actually was picked up in McKnight's today. So cool. Go look at that. But we basically wanted to answer that question of what is actually the impact to the business of a fall happening. I think when somebody's sent to the emergency room, CMS is paying, the family's paying, but the operator isn't paying the direct cost of that. And you hear numbers thrown around of like, the average, the number one cause of litigation is from falls, and a litigation might be like $300,000 on average or things like that. But it's hard to know what's actually like due with that number. Like how frequently does that happen, and blah, blah, blah. So what does it actually cost us? Like what does one fall cost an operator? We hired a research firm to do a big survey. They surveyed like 410 individuals within the industry, like 270 were executives, I think around 270. And then like around 130 were like care staff. So like a director of nursing or things like that. So from the 270 executives, it turns out that the 85% had actually calculated what is the cost of an individual fall to my organization. And that the number there was about $5,000. It was higher for skilled nursing folks. So it's like 6,300 in skilled nursing, and like 4,800 in senior housing. And the impact, like kind of what people were categorizing there were things like 1 in 7 move outs are due to a fall. Our clinical team spends 17% of their time, or about a day a week, working on falls. When somebody has a fall, they may, have a temporary move out. And the average temporary move out is 21 days. And during that time, we're not going to be charging for care services, or we're going to be giving back some rebate or things like that. So it kind of broke down what are all these reasons, folks maybe needing to move to an increased level of care. It's going to take more staff time from, our AED, talking to families when we're sending folks out and things like that. So I think really interesting to be able to like pin a number down that it's about $5,000 per fall.
Wow.
Yeah.
And you had talked about some of like the all encompassing numbers of how many falls you guys are seeing, but like, in some of these operators, if someone's got 100 beds, full census, like how many falls are they typically seeing within a month or a year?
Yeah. So it varies a lot. So it depends on the acuity level of the folks they're caring for, things like that. So I can say that like in a memory care unit, it's like a pretty common would be to have like 1 to 2 falls per individual in memory care per month. So if you're a 30-bed memory care, you're probably going to have like, and it will vary obviously, but I think a reasonable expectation is like 12 to 15 falls in a year for like a 30-bed memory care.
We talk about some of the direct costs and those add up, right? And it's been really interesting to see. I'm excited to read through that article here today or whenever this gets launched. So probably will.
I think some of the, just to wax on that a little, some of the nuance there is like, what do you call a fall? So when I say like 12 to 15 falls, what I'm really thinking about there are like falls that might have some injury that folks might like consider a fall. But what we see is that is really, I mentioned 40% of the time people are self-lowering. There's lots of opportunities there to keep folks out of the emergency room. But also we consistently see that only like 1 in 5 falls will result in an injury of any kind. So if you like are saying you have 12 to 15, you probably have like 5 times more than that. But there's no injury happening. But that doesn't mean there's not like an opportunity. Like that's our whole program. It's like, oh my God, we have the opportunity to see what's happening, make proactive interventions, like the lady with the bassinet. Like just because she didn't hurt herself going to the ground this time doesn't mean we don't have opportunities to be proactive and provide a better environment for her before she has something that does result in an injury.
Yeah, and it makes sense. I mean, and I've seen you present too, and I've seen some of the use cases, and it's just really interesting to see because, like, my understanding is if they walk into a room and just see someone on the ground, they have to send them out. And
it depends a lot. I think people know that it sucks to do that. It sucks for the resident, it sucks for the family, and so people try not to. But it's way worse to have the case where someone does have a brain bleed and you didn't send them and all of that. So they're kind of in a bind. And so what we will see is that a typical community will have like an 18 to 25% send out rate. So of their falls, they might send about 20% to the emergency room. For folks on our program, we're today at a 2% send out rate. So like we will show a 10x reduction in the number of ER visits you have from falls. And that obviously is like just the number of incident reports, but also like the number of stressful conversations that people need to be having with families. Being able to have 10 times fewer of those, it's just like, and like how evangelical the families are about it and blah, blah, blah. It's awesome.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And, you had alluded to it a little bit earlier, George, of like the amount of time spent or dedicated to falls, right? And I think it's necessary. And I'm curious in your report, and maybe you've just seen it in other ways, but like, how much, and we talk about the labor shortages right now too, right? Where I think a lot of time is being spent on these falls. How much time is clinical staff usually spending, whether it's per fall or per month, or do you have any insights on that?
So what we saw is it's about 17% of time pretty consistently, which might equate to like about a day a week. So a lot of time directly, but also a lot of that time is quite stressful, right? Like it's responding to, someone who's, in a not great situation, blah, blah, blah. And I think one of the things with, all of the turnover in this space, I know both of us have spent a lot of time, in memory care and like in communities themselves. And I think one of the big things we see is like with turnover being so high, when you're in a memory care with like just a truly rock star memory care director, I'm sure you've probably seen some folks like that, where it's like, it's incredible how they know exactly the reality that every person is living in, and they can just like step right into that reality. I saw it with the first time I remember Sherilyn at a Carleton community, if you're listening, shout out. It was incredible how she could just like step right into the reality, know exactly like what they're thinking about. And like, they're standing by the door because they're waiting for, their children to come pick them up or whatever else, and like step right in and be really like such a source of like comfort. I think one of the hard things is like with so much turnover, people don't necessarily have the time to build that like understanding with each resident and their own kind of specific needs. So a big piece of it is also, it's not just like the direct time savings, it's also like keeping the bar for care very high through turnover and things like that, so that we can basically understand what are the unmet needs for folks without having, how do we have every resident have access to that, your Sherilyn or whatever, have access to, that rockstar memory care director, even if we have turnover and whatever. And we obviously can't do it for everything now, but we can definitely do it for falls to like really understand what's the unmet need for folks.
Yeah, it's important, right? I mean, and even you say 17% of the time, 1 day per week. And if you're able to give any of that back, it can be more focused on getting to know those residents. And Sherilyn's awesome. Sherilyn's great.
Yeah. Do you know her?
Yeah, of course I know Sherilyn.
Oh,
she's awesome. Yeah.
She is awesome.
So I know like over the course of this conversation, George, you kind of talked about how SafelyYou and some of the results you guys have seen, but I'm curious, if there's any key metrics or key things that you've seen. I think you mentioned like 40% reduction of how implementing SafelyYou is helping senior living providers and individuals today.
Yeah, here. So high level, we did. So I mentioned there's really two parts of the program, right? It's like, don't send folks to the ER if they went to the ground intentionally, but also let's reduce the true number of falls people are having by understanding what are the unmet needs, providing proactive interventions and all of that. What we market is 40% fewer falls. So 40% fewer times someone's going to the ground to begin with, and 80% fewer emergency room visits, because we're both having fewer falls and we're not sending the 40% that actually lower themselves to the ground intentionally and then couldn't get back up on their own. Those numbers were based on kind of research studies we did. You might remember we really went one step at a time. We started with one community, then we made sure that was reproducible with 11 communities, and then we've kind of grown from there. We've continued to track what's our rates and like had confidence around that, because obviously, we don't want to be marketing something that we don't think we can deliver on. Of course. And so we did an analysis of 3,000 folks on the program. And what we saw is actually a 50% reduction in the on the ground events. I believe this is the biggest impact with the biggest sample size that's ever been shown around like truly reducing the number of falls. So this isn't like, 10 people, this isn't like 100 people, this is 3,000 people that we're looking at. And what we're looking at is what's the impact for an individual on the program over the first 6 months they're on the program. And what's the expected basically fall rate for them. And what you can see is within 3 months, you're hitting this threshold here where you're now down to about a 50% reduction in the number of expected falls, and then that being sustained from there. So like huge pride in this. Like it's a testament to obviously so many things working, the clinical team doing an incredible job, all of that being really proactive. But we're basically now at a point where we just have like a lot of confidence that we really do reduce falls. We know that cost is about $5,000 per fall. We can kind of do the math together. Like it's not just about how much good we can do for residents, but also what are the hard dollars. And I think you and I both know like it's kind of our obligation as folks that try to provide solutions to really support like what's the business case for this? How do you actually save money or make money from this? Because if you're going to do it at scale, like we need to be able to know that it's really making the business money and it's not just like a good thing to do, but it's actually driving the business forward.
Yeah, I love it. It's one of those things that makes it a win-win for everybody and all parties involved, right? And it's, entrepreneurs like you that are helping to create these services, which, being in those communities, getting the feedback and, just trying to create a better world for not just the communities and the residents, but for our families as well. And, that is what it's all about.
Yeah, here. I'm curious to hear, I know you guys have been doing some like pretty interesting work as well. I'm curious to hear kind of if you have any recent numbers or anything that you'd like to highlight.
So I think in terms of like the business case, so one of the things we had all this anecdotal evidence around how, because I think for Eversound, it's an easy way to show how it's improving quality of life for people living there, right? I mean, just in terms of better hearing, better experiences. Cool. But we just had a group do a 3-month study using Eversound in the sales process and, comparing it to other communities within their profile that didn't have Eversound. We saw about like a 33% increase in tour to move-in ratios. And then also about, I think the average was about 1 to 2 residents, just tipping the scales to get them to move into one community over the course of 6 months. So, anywhere from 2 to 4 per year, where there's real dollars behind that. And, we've got it was really cool that I remember talking to one of the adult children who picked one of these communities during that pilot, who called me out of the blue and was like, hey, this has been a prayer answered. Like, I'm actually able to talk to my mom now. It's actually cutting the amount of time it takes to do other things because I can use this tool and she can actually hear me. So we are sharing that with the world. It was with Vitality Senior Living, and big shout out to Julie Podowitz and her team there. But it was just great to kind of get that data behind it. Cause like I could tell so many stories and, and they're true stories too, but it's just like great to have some of that data to help back some of that up. So that's been really cool to see that, that come to fruition and our hypothesis were true.
And like something that you've probably kind of known intuitively, like you've seen anecdotally, like people move in because of the system, right? Yep. And I think it's like, first of all, amazing result. And like, obviously real dollars associated with that. Like you can do the math of like one move in, what margin are we at? Like, okay, like this is real profit, that we wouldn't have otherwise had, blah, blah, blah. And I think it's like, it's kind of like really fun to work on that stuff of like by virtue of like the product being as good as it is, like, that the Eversound product is elevating like what communities can do. And then you've like basically earned the rights to kind of like go the next step of like, okay, we know we just really help. So now like, how do we kind of bridge the gap of like, what does this actually mean in terms of like the dollars and cents for the business? Yep. We kind of same thing on the move-in front. We typically will often with like a larger enterprise, we'll start with a kind of a 60-day pilot and show the outcome from a clinical standpoint, but also like almost every time we'll have a move-in for the system during that period. And it's like, oh, we had a move-in from it, paid for it. Cool. Like, let's go. And I think it's like by virtue of both of our products just like working really well, you like earn the right to get to like have those conversations. Yep. And there is, I think we're, both in it because we care. And there's like nothing more gratifying than like the families, like getting to connect with the families and hearing like folks say things like, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, just yesterday, so there was someone that I knew who had used Eversound with her dad back in the day and used it successfully. And she worked at a community and her sister-in-law was struggling to communicate with her mother when she would go and visit. They've resorted to writing on a whiteboard. Like that's how they were having a conversation. So we sent them Eversound. They sent a letter yesterday just thanking us and like how it's kind of been like night and day and that they've been actually able to communicate with again. And it just, putting myself in their shoes, right? Like the matriarch or patriarch of your family and not being able to communicate with them anymore. And then just a simple piece of technology really just built to be useful and not difficult. It could just change a whole family's visit and change the dynamic. It's just,
and their whole, like for that individual, like their whole mental health, like they're so like being able to be more connected and all of that. And like, the hearing aid industry being like, we know how expensive hearing aids are and how easily they're lost and blah, blah, blah. And so having something that's more accessible that folks can stay connected and all of that. Yeah. Like what a game changer for people. I'm sure you've seen some of the data around how much loss of hearing can impact dementia, things like that as well.
If someone's got moderate or severe hearing loss, they're 3 to 5 times more likely to develop dementia, which is just mind blowing. And like, we even have some partners today who have told us that they had some residents they thought were later stage because weren't participating, weren't speaking, weren't engaging, and good pun. And then they use Eversound, and yes, they were living with dementia, but it was more so like a hearing loss component to it, and that's why they weren't really engaging, which is just like, it's mind blowing. And I think when you think of falls, right, there's epidemics when it comes to falls, and when I think of hearing loss, I think it's in a similar boat in terms of, it's just one of those things that when it happens, kind of take it for granted. And there's tools and companies out there like us who are trying to create solutions that actually work, and and that can actually just improve that quality of life.
Here. Yeah, I was thinking about how like it's really kind of a feedback loop of like, I think we know the things that delay dementia the most are staying socially engaged, good diet, exercise, like a lot of things that are just important for being healthy overall. And if you can't hear well and connect with your environment, like then you're losing the social engagement piece, and like then you're more likely to develop dementia, and like all of these things kind of feed on each other. And yeah, it's really cool to be able to like break the loop in that way, and be able to help keep folks connected. God,
that's what it's all about.
And you just keep coming back to thinking about the person themselves. It's like, imagine being that person and like what a difference you make, and how many thousands of lives do you think you've impacted now, Matt?
Yeah, so we like to think about that internally. Just, it's easy to talk about sales and revenue, but we always try to bring it back to like lives touched and lives impacted. And I think it's safe to say that number is, maybe 100,000 people by now. Just thinking if we're working with 1,200 communities today, and on average, they might have 100 residents, and Eversound is impacting them, or able to impact them. You can do the math with it's just. I'm very grateful to just help support some of those people on the front lines and give them tools to be successful and, again, improve that quality of life. And, I think as entrepreneurs, right, like that's the ultimate goal, is to create something that does some good in the world and leave your mark that way.
Well, I think shout out to you and the team. I know that takes everybody to make that happen.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I don't know that every entrepreneur's goal is to make good in the world.
Know.
I think you're a special kind of entrepreneur that like, we're in it for the impact, right? Like the finances are a means to an end, but we're really here to just like try to help people like our own, parents and other folks that we love.
Amen, brother. Well, George, thanks so much for joining us today. I know our listeners will get a lot out of this, and just appreciate who you are and what you represent, and look forward to when our paths cross here sooner than later.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Check out the State of Falls report. We're going to be continuing to release. We just have an obligation to release all of our learnings and data and stuff like that. So we'll likely be doing something like that every year. And don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions or want help kind of unpacking the data.